So thanks to all of you for coming, who are here virtually or in person. As some of you may or may not know, earlier, I guess not earlier this fall because we're at the start of a new year, but this past September and October, I released a new book that I had been working on for close to 11 years. And it was a really exciting and turbulent process bringing it to completion. And I'm grateful for any opportunity to share the project with as many people as possible. So I appreciate you guys showing up today. The book is a collection of essays called A History of Photography in Indonesia from the Colonial Era to the Digital Age. It was co-published by Afterhours books in Jakarta and Amsterdam University Press in Amsterdam. And what I wanted to do today was give a brief overview of the book and how it came to be. But realistically, like the book all started here in the Rare and Manuscript Collections at Cornell. And there are several collections which we have out here that you can take a look at a bit more later after I finish talking, that are really at the heart of the collection, at least in my mind. I think the book obviously became much bigger than the offerings that Cornell has, but it really started as a curious young photographer, maybe not so young, but as a curious photographer who also had a really profound curiosity about Indonesia. And with limited resources, I was able to start building a network of different scholars and artists around the world who ended up contributing to the book. And that network started with things that I discovered here at Cornell. So the book, as I said, or I guess I didn't, I suggested, is a collection of essays. There are 18 essays in the book. I wrote 6 of them and solicited different writers from around the world to contribute. The whole thing was structured in such a way that each one of the essays can be read individually and independently of the rest of the book. Each one of them is an individual piece. I'll talk more about the individual essays and the contributors a little bit. But it's also structured in such a way that each one of the essays happens chronologically, and collectively you start to get a sense of how the medium of photography developed in the archipelago. But I also wanted to start, again, at the roots of how this all happened. And as I said, it dates back about 11 years. In 2011, I was teaching photography at a small art college about 2 hours southwest of here in Alfred, New York. And at that particular time, like I was living in Ithaca, and at that particular time, I got a really small kind of seed grant to go to Indonesia to try and put a new project together. I was just there for a few weeks. The initial project that I put together had nothing to do with photography, actually. Being part of a SUNY system, it was actually much more about art education. So I went over to Java to just meet some people in art education and talk about putting together some collaborative programmings between schools in the SUNY system and in Central Java. While I was there, I had the really good fortune to meet some really interesting and eclectic photographers living and working in Java. As well as some kind of curators and publishers, and really started to understand that photography and its role in art education and in the fine art world of Indonesia was very young. And learning all of that got me much more interested in trying to put something together, some kind of project or research project together in Indonesia that was much more about photography than what I had learned about the art education programs I visited in Java. The whole book, I think in many ways, has really, really humble origins, but the origins facilitated some really important connections. And it all started as this like WordPress blog I started in 2011, where I would literally come down here and look through photographs and jot down some notes, and it was all made in real time. And that started in 2011. In 2013, I was contacted by this woman named Gail Newton, who at that time was curator of photography at the National Gallery of Canberra. And she was researching a major exhibition, what at this point is still the largest exhibition of colonial era photographs from Indonesia held. That was at the National Gallery of Canberra in 2014, I think opening in January. And Gail contacted me, and I ended up working with her for about a year and a half between early 2013 and the summer of 2014, kind of as a consultant on the project. Like I would sometimes come down into the archives and here at Cornell and look up things for her. And we had a lot of email back and forth. She told me at that time I was the only person she knew of in the United States doing this kind of work. And the connection at the National Gallery was really important for a lot of reasons. The particular slide we're looking at right now is from a chapter that Gail contributed to the book, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I include it here because the top image we're looking at is actually an installation view of the exhibition she put together called the Garden of the East, or maybe just Garden of the East. A really stunning exhibition that included hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs from the colonial era of Indonesia, mostly from like 1840 to maybe 1920 or 1930. And actually, as part of that collaboration we developed, I was invited to the National Gallery in the summer of 2014 to participate in a panel discussion they had together with several different artists and writers looking at Indonesian photography. But it was really important in a lot of ways. Thinking of it in relation to the book that I just put out, one of the things that I think is unique about the book is that it pulls together, I think for the first time, the major photographic collections of colonial era Indonesian photography in the world for the first time. Right, so to the best of my knowledge and the research I've done, the biggest collections are the National Gallery of Australian Canberra, the University of Leiden, Perpustakaan Nasional, the National Library of Indonesia, and Cornell. And what was really pivotal about working with Gail is I had access to that entire archive for free to put the book together. And I have tremendous gratitude to her and the National Gallery for that. But it also started, it kind of like lit a fire of belief for me that this was a much more important project than I thought it was. Like I thought it was somebody with an MFA who was looking at old pictures of Indonesia, but I found like a collaborator who was taking this really seriously, who had a lot of influence and a lot of ideas, and it got me to take it pretty seriously as well. As a result of the research I had been doing between 2011 and 2014, I was given a pretty major grant from the American Institute for Indonesian Studies and lived in Java for 6 months at the beginning of 2014. Really kind of doing my own thing. I did a lot of studio visits with artists. I went to amateur photography workshops. I taught amateur photography workshops. I combed different archives, really creating an immersive experience in Javanese photography. Based on the success of that time, I came back and I was offered a 3-year research fellowship at the Southeast Asia program at Cornell, which culminated in an exhibition, which some of you might remember, that was held at the Johnson Museum in the spring term of 2017. This was really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it was a really thrilling opportunity. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first exhibition devoted to work by Indonesian photographers held in the United States. And it gave me a lot of legitimacy in Indonesia as I continued the project. And I guess about the same time, like, well, between 2014, 2017, like fresh off my APHIS fellowship, I came back and I had this idea. It's like, okay, there are some books about colonial era photography in Indonesia, mostly monographs of the major contributors, a few kind of surveys. And there's one book published by the Friends of Photography in San Francisco by a woman named Jane Livingston Reed that looks at early 20th century photography in Indonesia. But there was really no comprehensive history of photography. And I started to think that this was a really important thing to do. Like I had this really dynamic and fulfilling experience working in Indonesia, albeit for a relatively short period of time. And then the connections that I now had with Cornell and the National Gallery of Canberra really led me to believe that this book was a good idea and even a possibility. And I was invited by another blog kept in Singapore by a photographer in Singapore named Wu Ben Zhuang. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And he solicited me to write something about my research for that blog. And I wrote at that point what became the introduction to this book. And I wrote kind of like as a footnote for the essay that he published that I was interested in doing this book on the history of photography in Indonesia. And I was contacted at that time by the director of Afterhours books in Jakarta. Afterhours is a publisher that specializes in art and like really visual books about Indonesian culture. And he said to me, like, if you ever do this book, like, let me know, I want to do it. And when I did this exhibition with the Johnson Museum, they offered to print a book with it. I was like, Yahtzee. And they said I had really free reign to do what I wanted. And I contacted Afterhours and I said, like, let's do this. And if it works, maybe it's a stepping stone to putting together a larger project. And it did. So the bulk of the book, like as I said, it dates back to 2011. And the particular contributions that I made to the book are really rooted in a lot of the research I was doing in the archives between 2011 and 2014, the archives right here. But the bulk of the book was written between 2017 and 2019. I had an idea, like strangely, I was just out for a run one spring afternoon. And I said to myself, if I were to write this book, it would take so long. You know, like I have an MFA, I'm not trained as a researcher, never taken an art history class. And I had really limited economic resources to spend time in Indonesia. And like there are various hurdles that would keep me from doing something like that. So I had this idea of trying to put together a compilation of essays that would look at the history of photography. And in the relationship that I developed with the Southeast Asia program and in the Johnson Museum, I met some really interesting writers who were looking at photography in Indonesia. So these next two slides I'm showing you are just the table of contents of the book. And I can tell you a little bit more about each one of the essays. I'm going to walk through and show you page spreads from each one of them. But my whole idea in putting it together and finding writers is I wanted it to be really international. Though that said, I think 7, depending on what you call Indonesian, there are 7 or 8 writers that come from Indonesia. But there are writers from Europe, Australia, and the United States as well. And I also wanted it to be really interdisciplinary. So there are articles that are really academic by like PhDs and anthropology and whatnot. There are art historians, curators, and studio artists. And actually one person whose day job is writing like Lonely Planet guides to Indonesia. So you have a really eclectic mix, and all of that was really quite intentional. Like I wanted it to be something that would appeal to a broad audience in Indonesia and beyond. And I wanted to think about photography multiplicitously, like as an art, as a social document, as an anthropological tool. So the various contributors, as you can see here, and I'll go through each one of the chapters, Gail Newton from the National Gallery of Canberra. Matthew Cox is currently a curator in New South Wales. He was an art history student that studied with Adrian Vickers. If any of you are up on Indonesian studies, Adrian Vickers is a pretty prominent name. I wrote several, especially right here in the middle. Aminuddin T.H. Siregar is a professor at the Institute of Technology in Bandung, West Java, and is currently a PhD student at Leiden University. Oscar Matolo is a photographer from Java. Karen Strassler is both one of my heroes, one of my favorite writers on Indonesia, and an anthropologist in New York City who has made a study of photography her primary tool as an anthropologist. Krishnamurti is a new media and video artist from Jakarta. Suprapta Sujono is also of Javanese descent. He teaches in Yogyakarta right now. but did his master's and PhD work here in the United States, in Buffalo, actually. I've always imagined it must be so shocking for people to like come from Southeast Asia and go to Buffalo winter. Wimo Ambalabayong is a very prominent contemporary artist in Java. Adelina Luft, I think, has dual citizenship. She is from the Czech Republic, though married to Wimo Ambalabayong. She did a PhD in art history at Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta. Jeremy Allen is a travel writer and a novelist, and originally from Canada, but has been living in Indonesia for close to 50 years now. Alexandra Kumala is from Jakarta, that was currently living in Colombia. At the time I worked with her to put this essay together, she was living in New York City and trying to work as a performance artist. Brent Luvas is an anthropologist at Drexel University in Philadelphia, who studies blogging and new media as his tools for anthropology. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Tino Giumini when we get to that chapter, because his background says a lot as to why I chose to end the book with his essay. So again, like the idea in putting each one of these essays together, most of them were written for the book. There were two or three that were published prior to this book that I got permission to use again. I wrote the introductory chapter. If you know much about the history of photography or anything but the history of photography, the first photographic patents were taken out in 1839, and it spread like wildfire across Europe and into the United States. It became kind of a prominent part of Dutch culture around 1840, 1841, though interestingly enough, the Dutch were the first colonial government to hire photographers to document their colonial work, their enterprise in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. So this first chapter looks at how photography was invented, how it got to the Netherlands, and how the Dutch took it to Indonesia. Really going from 1840 until about maybe 1860, 1870. And it focuses mostly on the technologies and what didn't work early on, how it was appropriated, and what types of things it was used to document. And it also highlights a lot of the really prominent colonial era photographers that we know about: Woodbury and Page, Isidore van Kinsbergen, Adolf Schaefer, and Cassian Chepas, the first known photographer of Javanese descent. We're going to talk about him a bit later. When I solicited Gail Newton to contribute to this, I had a very vague idea of what I wanted her to write about. And I mostly wanted her to talk about the collection that she put together. So outside of Leiden, in the Netherlands, University of Leiden, the National Gallery of Canberra has the largest collection of colonial era photographs from the Dutch East Indies. And I wanted her to relate how that happened. But I also knew in this first chapter, when I was writing about kind of the early photographic practitioners, I missed some really important people whom I didn't think should be excluded in the book. So I asked her to see if she could, while writing about the collection, if she could highlight some of these things that I didn't really get to in mine. And I've also deliberately tried, and this is one of the examples that we're looking at, way too often, histories of Indonesia are histories of Java. And this book, unfortunately, is not really an exception. The book is very Java-centric. But we tried, my collaborators, tried to find exceptions to that as frequently as possible. And Gail ended up writing a lot about this really eccentric photographer from Sulawesi named PJ Najawan, who photographed in the Moluccas. And there's very little scholarship about him right now. But his photographs are hilarious, actually. He photographed the aftermath of earthquakes in eastern Indonesia, but he tried to photograph it like it was happening. So like you'd have people at right angles at the frame, so they're like being launched into space. So Matthew Cox, as I said, his primary interest is in colonial era photography, but I think he approached his look at early photographic practice in a much more theoretical or conceptual way than Gail and myself did. And he wrote this essay called Pictures of Power. And he starts by looking at how the native leadership, I don't like to use that word, but how the indigenous leadership of Indonesia responded to photography, how they used it to embellish their own cachet, both within their local communities and with their Dutch patrons, often photographing themselves with the uniforms that the Dutch gave them, as we're seeing here on the left. And he actually really traces that to the election of Sukarno, whom I think he creates a very convincing argument. Sukarno, if you're unfamiliar with Indonesia, was the first president of the free nation, who had, I think, an uncanny understanding of the role of photography as a political tool for his time. And within all of this, he kind of grounds it in traditional rhetoric of like how power and social significance would have been represented in Javanese culture, even pre-photography. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 are the bulk of my contribution. And it's actually kind of a comparison or a biographical study of two of my largest influences in looking at Indonesia, a German painter named Walter Spies, and an American art historian who's of great significance here at Cornell, Claire Holt. Both of these artists, neither one of them were really photographers, were active in Indonesia between the world wars, which I think is a remarkable time in Indonesian history, at least as far as visual culture. And this particular essay focuses on two types of photographic output they had. Neither one of them were trained as photographers, but both used it, I think, in really meaningful ways. Walter Spies collaborated with a Dutch choreographer named Beryl de Zoet to put together a book called Dance and Drama in Bali, which he photographed the entire thing. Really beautiful work, actually. And Claire Holt, one of her primary interests, as most of you know, was dance, like her kind of gateway into Indonesia. She was also trained as a dancer. And her dance photographs are really quite amazing. She took some of the photographs. She also hired photographers in Surabaya and Jakarta to make some of the photographs for her. The Claire Holt collection here was important, but as you may or may not know, the Claire Holt collection is divided into two archives. Most of her textual and research materials are here at Cornell, though there is some photographic material. But most of her photographs are at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. If any of you are interested in Claire Holt and haven't seen the archive in New York City, it's really quite gorgeous. She meticulously cataloged her photographs in this really, I think, conceptually interesting way at times. So this essay just really talks about their lives and their research in Indonesia, some parallels, and their shared interest in dance. A great deal of contemporary criticism and discourse in photography is looking at books. I think for a very long time, like art photography was prints on a wall. But I think in the last 20 to 25 years, there's been much more discussion about artist books and how photographers have used pictures to make narratives. And this particular chapter, again, one of mine, is called Mid-Century European Modernism, and then the name of four photographers, It's called Mid-Century European Modernism and the March Towards Independence. And it's about four photographers, Cassor Thuys, a Dutch photographer, Gotthard Cho, a Swiss photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who I think most of us know, the very iconic French photographer. Many people don't know he was married to a Javanese woman. And Niels Douws Dekker, whose collection is held here. I'll talk about Niels Douws Dekker a little bit more in just a minute. But all of these photographers published these really amazing books. And the whole idea is that in the wake of World War II, and the ever-changing technologies of photography. Like if you go back to like maybe the period between 1840 and 1920, like, I mean, you had to be a professional. Like early on in photography, you had to be a chemist. You had to make your own papers. You even had to sensitize your own film for making negatives. But as photography evolved mechanically, so did the opportunities to photograph. And part of the argument with this essay is that as more handheld cameras came into being and photographers got access to more domestic and personal situations while they were photographing, attitudes about colonialism changed tremendously. And this presents the idea that all of these photographers became really important early European voices calling for an end of the colonial era in Indonesia. This particular photograph is by Cas Orthus. He made this incredible book. I assume we probably have it here, but I don't know, called In Staten Verding, which means a state in the making. And it's divided into a series of chapters that are really about propagating an independent Indonesia. This is one of the last photographs in the book, and it's actually the signing of the Lincoln-Jati Agreement. And I don't remember the exact date. It was kind of a superficial agreement, but in theory at that particular time, the Dutch were giving control of Batavia, now Jakarta, to Indonesia. It was several years before they actually did that. But he ends the book with one of the first political pronouncements of a free Indonesia. The Niels Douws Dekker archives are all here at Cornell. Niels Douws Dekker has a really interesting story. Obviously born of Dutch heritage. He lived his entire life in Indonesia. As far as I know, he might have moved as he got older. And he considered himself Indonesian more than he did Dutch. And yet at the same time used his influence and privilege to advocate for an independent Indonesia. After World War II, Niels Douws Dekker had, I think, a ministry appointment in Indonesia, working for the Ministry of Culture and Education, and used that appointment to create this massive photographic archive of the archipelago. So if you go to look at the Niels Douws Dekker archive here, it's all presented under his name. But if you look at it, it's actually about half a dozen photographers that were disseminated around Indonesia to photograph. And the basic idea was to celebrate what is most unique about Indonesia. So you have Balinese dancers and like the Dayak tribes of Kalimantan and the nomadic tribes in Papua and Irian Jaya. But you're also showing Indonesia as a fully modern, independent country, ready to be an important contributor in the 20th century. Looking through these archives is incredible. That's the one thing I didn't pull for you to look at later, mostly because it's all loose photographs. But you can actually see how the book starts to materialize by looking at the photographs. One of my favorite parts of the book is the end papers, which is what we're seeing on the right, which is this really incredible montage, which I think shows so much about what his objective was in putting the book together. And then like you can be rooting through these piles of photographs and find something like you have on the left, which was a photograph that was obviously masked to be included in one of these montages, but never used. And then going through the photographs, you can see notes on the back of them about things that needed to be rephotographed, or presumably, like, a lot of it's in Dutch, so I might be making that up. But you can see crop marks and other notes that were being made to the printers to put the book together. Another thing I find really significant about this book, again, thinking of that idea of the critical discourse about photography books in the United States and Europe right now, I find this book to be strikingly similar to Edward Steichen's book, The Family of Man, which I assume you all know, but it's made 5 years before that, right? So the whole idea of Family of Man was to look at all of the dynamic differences of progress and identity around the world, but show that some kind of shared humanity. And I think he did, Niels Douws Dekker did something very similar. And as I said, 5 years earlier. There is a really small display pulled from the archives up in Prague right now, if you haven't seen those. The next essay, again, is one that I wrote. It's called A Short History of EFOS. EFOS stands for the Indonesian Press Photographic Survey. All of these photographs come from Perpustakaan Nasional, the National Library of Indonesia. EFOS was a very small collection of about 10 photographers whom were the only Indonesians who had press credentials during the Japanese occupation of World War II and the Indonesian revolt against the Dutch after World War II. So it's really the only visual archive presented by Indonesians of the independence movement. In Indonesia, these people have been given like presidential honors and towns and roads named after them, and have made a lot of really important photographs, about the independence movement. They photographed, I think, like into the 60s or 70s, but most people know them for what they did in the 40s and 50s. So both these page spreads are from that book. Or, I'm sorry, from that chapter of the book. The next essay kind of picks up around the late 50s or early 60s. Again, if you're familiar with the exhibition at the Johnson Museum, this essay was included in that book by Aminuddin Siregar. And it's actually about the first known essay written in Bahasa Indonesia, the national language of Indonesia, about photography as a fine art, printed in like the 1950s or 1960s. I should know that kind of stuff, but I'm really bad at dates. So he just looks at kind of like what these guys were thinking, like why they were trying to champion it as an art. At this particular time, like Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, outlawed Hollywood movies in Indonesia at the beginning of his presidency. And there was actually really pronounced kind of anti-photography and film sentiment, because like it was really deemed as a tool of colonialism rather than something that should be embraced as part of art education, which I'll get back to in a little bit, or even seen as a fine art. So these people, I think they were all in Bandung, were trying to create a new discourse around that. This next chapter was really fun to put together for me. Until between like the 70s, maybe a little bit later than that, and 2020, there was really only one photographic archive in Indonesia, and that was the Gallery Gallery Photojournalistic Antara, the Antara Gallery of Photojournalism. So Antara is kind of like the Reuters of Indonesia. It's just a news agency. And at some point, they decided to put together kind of a photographic archive. And the primary directive of that is they were having a really hard time getting photojournalists, because Indonesians really didn't really take photography seriously. And they felt if they could kind of create this archive and gallery and museum space, that they actually might get more people interested in joining the Antara news agencies as photographers. The person who wrote this essay, I'll get back to that in a second, was one of the founders of the gallery, Oscar Motolo, also a very prominent and influential photographer internationally. So I said wrote, and that I really liked putting this together. This was actually a lecture that Oscar Motolo gave at an art college in Yogyakarta in central Java about 3 or 4 years ago. I was kind of hounding him to write something about this, and he said he would do it, and he never did. So he sent me the lecture, and I translated it from Indonesian. And then he and I and one of his assistants kind of whittled it so that it reads more like an essay and less like a lecture. But this essay is about the founding of the Gallery of Photojournalism, the Antara Gallery of Photojournalism. This is the original site of it. These are the two journalists that gave him the mission to open the museum and the gallery. And it goes through Reformasi, which, if you don't know, is the name given to the student revolt that led to the toppling of their 30-plus year dictator in the late 1990s. So this was a really fun essay to work on. There are a lot of really great photographs from the Gallery of Antara. I did bring the book and hope that you'll look at it when I'm done talking. And I kind of want to drift off on a quick tangent and tell you that, like, really from the beginning, when I started working with Afterhours books in Jakarta to put this together, we both had the shared commitment that we wanted to emphasize the visual over the textual. So the book is really richly illustrated. And in this particular chapter, we are able to go pretty deep into the gallery archives to illustrate it. Karen Strassler wrote the next essay, a very prominent figure in Indonesian studies right now. She was living and doing her PhD work in Yogyakarta during the fall of Suharto, the dictator, I think, of 34 years. And that was really significant, right? So Suharto lost power in 1998. And photography was a really essential tool for that. And that's really the subject of her first book, Refracted Visions. And if you look back at that particular time in terms of photographic technologies, like digital was just happening, cell phones were just happening, and 1 hour photo labs were everywhere. And that was really important because, like, suddenly, like, you had this young, revolting body, not revolting and disgusting, but in revolt, group of students who had access to like ways of making and disseminating pictures that the government couldn't control. And that was such a successful thing that in the wake of Reformasi, a lot of people, a lot of Indonesians said, okay, like, let's embrace photography. It's the most democratic tool available. So for this particular essay, she looks at photography during that period through the lens of how photography was appropriated during the Jokowi election in 2014. Again, if you don't follow Indonesian studies or Indonesia, Jokowi was the first fully democratically elected president of Indonesia. And he was also the first person elected president to Indonesia that had no ties to the previous presidents. And just like our recent presidential elections, his election was a quagmire of deceit and media abuses and whatnot. So this essay kind of looks at the growth of democracy photographically in Indonesia. Like, everything she writes, it's totally brilliant. The next chapter is called New Media Culture by Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti is like the Bill Viola of Indonesia. Bill Viola is a really prominent and pioneering, like, first generation video artist in the United States. And Krishnamurti was doing that long before anybody else was doing it in Indonesia. And it's actually kind of a clumsy, this is one of the essays that has been published before. It's actually kind of a clumsy and outdated essay. And, like, I think if we look at a lot of early digital art, it seems kind of clumsy and outdated. But in this particular chapter, and this kind of comes up again, I tried to extend what was narrated by including more contemporary digital work to make it more kind of like a bedrock, like his essay, more of a bedrock of ideas and how they developed in Indonesia. One of the things I learned early on in 2011, when I started doing that research, as I said, I first went over to study art education, is that photographic education, the whole idea that photography should and could or should be understood as a fine art in Indonesia is a very, very new thing, particularly if you compare it to Europe or America, right? So photography became part of an art school curriculum in Europe after World War I, right, with the German Bauhaus education. And in the United States, it happened right after World War II. You started having your first photo programs emerging in Chicago and New York City and things like that. The very first degree in photography in Indonesia started in 1992, right? So like 50 years later than it did in the United States, which is a really significant thing, I think. So this particular essay is by Suprapto Sujono, who was the architect of the first photo program in Indonesia. He ended up working with the Ministry of Education to put it together and was a consultant for the programs that followed the one that he put together. So it's really an essay about the birth of photographic education in Java and Bali mostly. The next essay by Wimo and Balabayang. Wimo is a very difficult person to characterize. He's hilarious and smart and incredibly creative. He was one of the artists featured in the exhibition at the Johnson Museum. This was one of the essays that had been published previously, and it was actually published as a catalog essay for a book the Trompen Museum in the Netherlands put together about their collection of photographs of the Dutch East Indies. And in it, Wimo's mostly writing about the photographs in the collection and his experience in the early 21st century of a colonized Indonesia. Wimo was also one of the first graduates of the photo program, the first photo program in Java. And while a student there, formed a collective of artists called MES 56, a collective that has become of international significance. And I kind of had this idea that if you read Wimo's essay, he's saying as much about what he's doing as a contemporary artist as he is about the collection that he's writing about. Because he's writing about this idea of a way of seeing things that's distinctly Indonesian and isn't grounded in European visions or European visual vocabularies. So this is another one of those essays where I really extended the meaning of the text through the visual narrative. And it includes some of the pictures from the Trompen Museum, but it also includes a lot of photographs from the MES 56 collective. I have said this in different lectures before, and it always seems strange to me. This is my favorite page of the book. It's like this 500-page book, and this is my favorite page, largely because I think it surmises so much of what I think the book is about. If you're familiar with Indonesian history, you might recognize the picture on the bottom left. That is a photograph of Kartini and her sisters. Kartini was an Indonesian princess, right? She wasn't like part of the Sultanate, but she was kind of once removed from the royal family of, I don't remember what city she lived in. Very well educated, fluent in Malay and Dutch, and actually ended up writing a series of letters to a very prominent Dutch woman, which became published years later in a book called Letters from a Young Princess. And it's actually really advocating for women's rights and the end of colonialism in this really eloquent and beautiful way. She's celebrated like we celebrate Martin Luther King as like this really real visionary for women's rights and the end of colonialism. And there's some clear graphic similarities to this picture that we have on the right. This picture on the right is from the very first public exhibition by MES 56 at the Yogyakarta Biennial in 2003, where they did a show, or it's more like an installation or performance called Karendan Becken, which translates as cool and famous. What they did for this exhibition is they set up a photo booth in the gallery, and anybody could come in and have their picture taken with one of the members of MES 56, and they printed 2 copies right on the spot, gave one to the person who sat with them and hung the other on the wall. But what I like about it is you have the same picture architecture, you have the same triangle, and it's 2 voices of photographic freedom about 100 years apart. Because of the influence of MES 56, like they really legitimized photography as a fine art in Indonesia in a way that nobody had prior to them in the early 2000s, largely because of this exhibition at the Jogja Biennial. So because of that influence, there are 2 essays about them. This one is written by Adelina Luft, who's Wimo Balabayang's wife from the Czech Republic. And her essay is kind of like about the founding of MES 56 and how it's evolved and remained relevant for, at this point, 20 years, right? They emerged in the late 1990s, mid 1990s, almost 30 years at this point. And this chapter ends with the MES 56 exhibition at the Film Museum in Amsterdam, which I think was a remarkable accomplishment. If you follow contemporary photography, the Film Museum in Amsterdam is like kind of one of the meccas. It's one of the most important contemporary photography museums in the world. And MES 56 showed there, I think, in 2014. I had another problem in that there was a collection of photographers that I knew needed to be in the book, and I didn't know how to or where to put them. And I had a few drinks with a friend of mine in Jakarta, Jeremy Allen, who's the Canadian expat over there. And he just said, I'll take care of it, don't worry about it. And he just came up with this idea, looking at these 4 photographers, 2 from the Netherlands, 2 from Indonesia, and created this essay called Outsiders. One of the Indonesian photographers is Chinese. Chinese Indonesians have a very, very complicated relationship to the nation. And the other, that's Anton Gautama, Chinese Indonesian, and Rio Helmi, who is half Turkish, half Balinese. And then 2 Dutch photographers, Jan Banning and Rosa Verhoef. And he kind of put them all together and took their mixed heritage or their outsider views to put them together and talk about what they saw in Indonesia. This particular picture on the right is another one of my favorite photo books about Indonesia. Rosa Verhoef was born of mixed heritage. Her mother is Indonesian. Her father is Dutch, though she lived her entire life in the Netherlands. She went back to Indonesia to photograph because she felt the need to get in touch with that heritage, and made this book called Kopi Susu, which means coffee with milk, but it's also Indonesian slang for somebody of mixed racial heritage. And it's actually this really poetic, beautiful book. The 2 pictures on the left are Jan Banning, this really interesting Dutch photographer. Both his parents lived in Indonesia during the occupation, towards the end of the Dutch occupation. His father was enslaved by the Japanese and worked on railroads in Sumatra. Jan Banning went back and photographed in the 90s and photographed women who were forced into prostitution during the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. This was the last essay that I got for the book. It's not the last essay in the book. I'm almost done. So just a few more. And I think it's a really important contribution to the book. It was one of the hardest ones to put together. It's about Chinese Indonesians. And the woman who wrote it, Alexandra Kumala, from Jakarta, an artist who lived in New York, who's now living in Colombia. Before she left for New York, her mother gave her these photo albums looking at her family. And this had a huge impact on her. So when she got to New York City, she started looking at the history of these pictures and what it meant to be a Chinese Indonesian. It turns out her father owned what was a very famous portrait photo studio in Jakarta, like in the 60s or 70s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. I told you I never took an art history class, I'm bad with dates. So this is really about that. And she does a really good job of mixing these old photographs from her family with contemporary Chinese Indonesian artists. So I don't have those in the slide here, but you can take a look at those later. But that's a really controversial subject in Indonesia, talking about Chinese identity. So I'm really pleased that we got that chapter in the book. I think it adds a great deal to it. I mentioned in 2014, I lived in Indonesia for 6 months, and I spent most of that time in Bandung. And this chapter, it's called A City on the Move, Bandung Today. A City on the Move references this really major art exhibition in the late 1990s, put together by 2 German artists that looked at Southeast Asia and East Asia, and really for the first time brought contemporary Southeast Asian arts to Europe, but also presented this idea of what cities were going to mean in the 21st century and how we should start understanding them as visual expressions in and of themselves, but also these places as incubators for new ideas and artistic practices. So I kind of borrowed the whole idea, the premise of their exhibition as a way of reading what I saw in Bandung in 2014. This chapter also got a little circuitous. This is my favorite chapter that I wrote in the book. It actually ends with, again, if you're looking at Indonesian art history, Bandung has a very rich and complicated history. It is home to the Institute of Technology, which is the first Dutch university that let Indonesian students in it. It is home to some of the best Dutch architecture in Indonesia. And it's home to like some of the most revolutionary groups of Indonesia still today, right? Like you have a lot of political Islamic groups in Indonesia and the best art school in Southeast Asia. Like it's a really amazing and complicated city that way. And shortly after after Indonesia declared independence, Sukarno had this brilliant idea, the first president of Indonesia, to create something really akin to NATO, but it was just for the post-colonized nations. And he put this whole conference together it's usually called the Bandung Conference, but it's also called the Asia-Africa Conference. And American Richard Wright, the novelist, right, was living in Paris at this time. He's like, yes, I have to go there. Like this represents everything that I want represented, right? Like this end of colonialism. And he went over to document it, not knowing that he was actually working for the CIA. They paid for his entire trip and read everything he wrote about it. But I use that as a way to understand like Bandung kind of metaphorically today. So the chapter actually ends with Richard Wright's photographs of the Bandung Conference. The last chapter is by Brent Luvas, an anthropologist at Drexel, looking at Instagram street photographers in Jakarta. So I said I didn't want to tell you too much about the author of the last chapter, Tino Jumini. But I thought like I present this as an afterword rather than a chapter because I think it does a really good job of surmising the complexities of photography as an issue of personal and cultural identity. So Tino was orphaned at birth. He's born in Bandung. He was adopted based on a photograph that was sent to some connection in the Netherlands that this orphanage had. A Dutch woman adopted him based on that picture, and the orphanage walked him to the plane and flew him to the Netherlands. He's just a couple years old. And he lived with a Dutch family that had many kids. He was the only adopted one, and he was raised as one of them. Really well educated and completed degrees in philosophy and visual culture. When he was done with those degrees, he felt he needed to explore his identity as an Indonesian and went back and did this really great photographic project called Karabat, the Arabic word for relatives, also the Indonesian word for relatives. And this essay is about what photography means to him as a tool that led to his adoption and childhood in the Netherlands, and how it was a tool for him to re-engage and connect with his Indonesian heritage. The last thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to let you guys look at the pictures I brought, or if you have any questions, that's fine too, is I want to talk about, like, as I said, this whole thing started with the collections here. And there are 4 or 5 really significant photographic collections from the Dutch East Indies here at Cornell. I mentioned in relation to the first chapter that the first known photographer of Indonesian descent was this man named Kasian Cepas, who photographed like around the 1860s, 1870s into the early 20th century. He was Christian. He converted to Christianity, which is really rare. And he was also fluent in Dutch, which was almost unheard of at that time. He became the staff photographer for the Javanese Sultanate, and also ended up working with the physician of the Javanese Sultanate in Yogyakarta, this guy named Isaac Groningen, who was an amateur archaeologist. And the two of them put together this incredible portfolio that we have over here on the left of the table, where Kasian Cepas photographed a lot of the dances and ritual events of the Kraton, the royal house in Yogyakarta, with textual descriptions of what each one of those things are, written by Groningen. I love that we have this. It was printed in Leiden in 1888. And it's a portfolio, not a book. So it's original albumen prints, which is one of my favorite photographic processes, and is really the predecessor of what became a traditional black and white photographic process. Another real gem that we have here, right in the middle of the book's if we go into a second edition of this book, or if I get a chance to do it, there are three things that are missing. And one of them is Japan, right? Like, so if you don't know much about the history of Indonesia, Japan occupied the nation between two different Dutch occupations, right? So the Dutch occupied until World War II. The Japanese overthrew them and took control of the country for a few years. And then they were expelled after World War II when the Dutch came back in. But I have to imagine that there's an incredible trove of photographs of the Japanese occupation somewhere. But there is one Japanese photographer that has some kind of international prominence, KT Satake, who photographed in Indonesia in the early 1930s. He drove from Sumatra to Bali and photographed the whole thing. I find this book to be an incredible example of book technologies from its time. I can't quite tell if it's printed in a lithographic process or a process called rotogravure, which I'll get to in just a minute, but it's a photo atalio process where you etch a photograph in copper and ink it. The color reproductions in this are so hard to come by, which is what makes me think it's rotogravure. Like, I left this particular page on the right open because you can really see how it was printed. It's 4 different copper plates, and they kind of got the registration off a little bit, but really incredibly rich colors from a really primitive and difficult photomechanical process. They did another really interesting thing in this book. I guess this probably would have been before we got into duotone or tritone or quadtone technologies, but if you know what that means, like a modern black and white photographic book would be printed in what we call tritone or quadtone, where they would actually print an image 4 times with 4 different colors of ink, right? So that you have your black ink, your gray ink, your white ink, and something in between. And I think these were printed before that was really done, but you can see they tried to use a similar strategy, and they used different like sepia and olive color inks, creating a really kind of pictorial or romantic sort of visual expression. This is one of my favorite things in the archives and represents a remarkable technical photographic achievement. Featured in Gail Newton's chapter, I mentioned that there were a few photographers I felt needed to be in the book, but I didn't know where they belonged, and I knew she knew something about it. One of them was this woman named Tilly Weisenborn, a Dutch photographer who lived most of her life in Indonesia. These are made in a process called photogravure, right? Which, as I said, is a process where you etch a photographic negative into a copper plate and print it like traditional printmaking. Rotogravure became kind of the commercial bastard of that. But a handmade, I want to back up for a second, and it'll make sense in a minute. When we look at the really early history of photography of Indonesia, there's one daguerreotypist that emerges, this German photographer named Adolf Schaefer, right? So if you know the history of photography, the first photographic patent was taken up by this French guy named Jean-Louis Daguerre for a process called daguerreotype, a one-of-a-kind direct positive on a highly polished steel plate. So when we talk about daguerreotypy in Indonesia, we only talk about Adolf Schaefer. But the reality of it is there were dozens of people who tried to do it, but the humidity and the conditions of Indonesia made it prohibitively difficult. And actually that first daguerreotypist, Adolf Schaefer, was trained by Jean-Louis Daguerre himself before he went to Indonesia. This process, photogravure, I think is actually even more difficult than daguerreotypy. And it is made by first, you take a very toxic chemical called ammonium dichromate, and you saturate a gelatin with that, and you expose your photograph to it, and the gelatin becomes insoluble in water in relation to exposure. Dichromate is light sensitive, right? And then while that's wet, you have it on a piece of paper, you have to transfer it to an aqua tinted copper plate and squeegee it down without breaking it and let it dry, and that becomes your etching resist, right? So it's incredibly fragile, it's incredibly toxic, and it's incredibly difficult. So the fact that Tilly Weisenborn did these in West Java, just outside of Bandung in 1928, is really amazing. The process, if you look at these, was really famous with American and European photographers at that time because it's incredible rich tonalities. So these prints of Tilly Weissenborn's are amazing. I don't know how many photographs Claire Holt made of her own and how many she purchased or commissioned. But as I said, going to New York City and looking at her albums is an incredible treat. Like, they're really well organized and the photographs are amazing. There are some really great photographs here in this collection. I'm putting this together. I said I'd talk about collections here. These are actually both here. These are photographs from her last trip to Indonesia. The picture we're looking at on top is a classroom at the Institute of Technology in Bandung, which is often called one of the best art colleges of Southeast Asia. And those would actually, I can't tell you now, it's probably in the book, who all those painters are, but most of the people in that picture went on to be famous Indonesian painters. And the picture on the bottom is the famous Javanese painter Affandi and his family. I already talked about the Douws Dekker stuff. If you're at all interested in photography in Indonesia, I think this is the most important holding in the Cornell collection. In 1976, right before he died, the whole collection was donated to Cornell. Is that right, Greg? You know the history of that? It's on the website. Like, I'm pretty sure that's accurate. And that's the last slide that I have. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. If you want to come up and look at the materials I pulled out of the archives, that's fine too. So thank you again for coming. He's going to give you a microphone because we're on Zoom.
Oh, man. Okay. So first, thanks so much for the talk. And I really appreciated all the effort that you put into describing photographic processes for us. That's really cool. And I knew nothing about that, so I really appreciated learning about that. I had one suggestion for a contact. I don't know if you talked to her already about the Japanese occupation. Meta Etsinga is a PhD student here. She primarily works on film in Indonesia. She works with Kaya McGowan.
Yeah, I know who she is, but I've never met her.
Yeah, but she presented a couple of years ago at AAS on the Japanese occupation era and the influence of film, Japanese film styles on Indonesian film.
Interesting.
So she may know about photography from that period also. That sort of goes into my actual question, which was, what else would you include if you were gonna? You mentioned one thing. That
okay, so
left us hanging for the other two.
Yeah, so like one thing I don't think I really mentioned is the concluding this book was really tumultuous, right? Like, I've been working with Afterhours from 2017 to 2020, and they did a remarkable job of designing the book. And I think it's their vision as much as mine. I loved working with them. But we hit this wall in 2020 because all of their money evaporated and they could no longer publish the book. Like a lot of COVID stuff, right? Like Afterhours is really dependent on donors. Like, art books are expensive to make, and all those donors and cultural connections dried up. So I spent a couple of years, like a year and a half, trying to find a way to get it published. And I spent so much time doing that I kind of forgot to bolster any more content. And I guess like the two things that I think are missing, I think I said three earlier, and for the life of me, I can't think of what the third one is right now. So I'll tell you when I think of it later. But the two things that I know of right now is I think something about Japanese photography would be really important. So the book was printed twice. It was printed in Amsterdam and is printed in Jakarta. And I was in Jakarta in September launching the book there. And I participated in a big photo festival there, the Jakarta International Photo Festival, JIPFest. And there was this whole collection of photographers I knew nothing about. Like, my whole like as a researcher, as a photographer, I mean, I hate Jakarta. And as a researcher and photographer, I've spent all my time in Jogja and Bandung. But when I was at this photo festival, I met this incredible group of young documentary photographers, like these people in their late 20s, early 30s, that are doing really amazing work that isn't like quite photojournalism, but probably more in tune of that tradition than what's coming out of Jogja and Bandung. Significant in that every year, like the world's biggest photo festival happens in Paris through the Aperture Foundation. They're stationed in New York City. And in 2021, for the first time ever, an Asian and Indonesian photographer won their award for biggest achievement of the year. And that's about this incredible series of photographs he did in Banda, right, which is where nutmeg is native, right? So I'd actually really like to do something on kind of contemporary documentary photography in Jakarta. And then, I mean, as I said, it's also really Java-centric, so it'd be nice to build beyond that. And I'll have to think of what that third thing I was thinking of half an hour ago was. That's a good idea. I'd have to think about it. That's a good idea because, like if you've read Karen Strassler's first book, Refracted Visions, she does talk a lot about the use of propaganda photography by the New Order, like in the 70s and 80s. I mean, there's so much you could talk about. In fact, I have started to put together a new book proposal of something that I would like to do. And that does kind of take on some things that this doesn't, about the influence of tourism in the last 30 or 40 years in Indonesia and stuff like that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, in that case, I was hoping people would look at some of this stuff because it's very rare that we give ourselves the opportunities to look in archives. And my whole approach, like, as I said, I have an MFA in photography, is I think there's a big distinction between photographs and images. I think when we're looking at Instagram, we're looking at images, not photographs. And I still think of photographs as something that has a material presence and changes over time. So I always love the opportunity to come places like this and look at the original materials. So thanks again for coming today.